Hi everybody, welcome to our first Hurricane Irma video math lesson. So today, if you can print out the notes that we posted on Edmodo, you can follow along with the worksheets that I'm going to do with examples of triangle congruency. So you'll want to follow along with day 2 notes. Okay, name all the sides and angles of triangle FGH. We first need to draw a picture, label the points, and then I'm going to label using correct notation segment FG, segment FH, segment GH, and then I have my 3 angles. Okay, so what is true about angle K and angle M? Well, I have to pay attention to the lines that are already on here. Those are congruency lines, so that tells me that angle I is congruent to angle N. And then I also know these two have 2 lines, so that means that those 2 angles are congruent. Angle J is congruent to angle M. And so, because I know that all the angles in a triangle add up to 180 degrees, I know that these 2 angles must be congruent also. So angle K is congruent to angle L. So what does it mean for 2 segments to be congruent? They must have the same length. Okay, so if you flip to the next page, we have a couple things about triangle congruent statements. So the first thing is just that if any 2 geometric figures have exactly the same shape and size, then we consider them congruent. And you already know this from working with line segments and angles before. Now we're just going to put it all together and work with triangles. So in 2 congruent triangles, all of the parts of one triangle are congruent to all of the corresponding parts of the other triangle, in other words, all of the angles and all of the sides. And these corresponding parts include corresponding angles and sides. So if I have a triangle ABC, and I have another triangle marker's not working very well. Triangle DEF, I can match up the corresponding angles. So if I know that angle A is congruent to angle D, and angle B is congruent to angle E, and angle C is congruent to angle F, if the 2 triangles are congruent, then side AB must be congruent to side DE, side BC must be congruent to side EF, and side AC is congruent to side DF. And then I know I have congruent triangles. Okay, so when you're told that 2 triangles are congruent, you have to be really careful to line up the angles and the sides correctly. So on the other page, we were talking about triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF, and I had the shapes lined up exactly the same, so it was pretty obvious. But so now if I say triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF, what that tells me is that angle A is congruent to angle D, angle B is congruent to angle E, and angle C is congruent to angle F, because I have to pay attention to the order that the letters are written in the congruency statement. You can also look at the marks here. So I can tell that there's 1 mark here, and there's 1 mark on angle D. That tells me that those 2 angles are congruent. There are 2 marks on angle B, and 2 marks on angle F, that tells me that those two angles, angle B and angle F, are congruent. And then there are 3 marks on angle C and 3 marks on angle E, and that tells me that those angles are congruent. The same goes for the sides. So if I'm trying to show that the sides are congruent, I know that segment AB, those are the first 2 letters in the statement, so segment AB is congruent to segment DE. And segment BC is congruent to segment EF. Segment AC is congruent to segment DF. So when you're working with triangle congruency problems, just make really sure that you're paying attention to the order that things are written. Okay, the first example pretty much goes back to the problem that we just talked about. So if we're just given the triangle congruency statement that ABC is congruent to triangle DEF, I know without drawing a picture that AB is congruent to DE because they're in the same order. I know that BC is congruent to EF. And I know that AC is congruent to DF. I also know that my angles have to match up. So angle A is congruent to angle D. Angle B is congruent to angle E. And angle C is congruent to angle F. Okay, so here we have example 2. Suppose that triangle TBS is congruent to triangle FAM. What angle is congruent to angle B? Well, B is in the second spot, so it has to be angle A. What side is congruent to side FM? Well, FM has the outside letters, so it has to be congruent to TS. And what side is congruent to SB? Well, these letters look like they're kind of backwards, but that's okay. So SB, just go in the same order, is congruent to MA. Okay, so most of the problems you have are going to be a lot more complicated than just naming congruent parts. We're going to give you pieces of a triangle and ask you to use the clues in the triangle to figure out the values of angles and sides. So in this problem, you have to read the problem. We always talk about not skipping over reading the problem. So you have a big clue here that triangle ABC is congruent to DBC. So before you do anything else, what you should do is mark up your triangle with the congruent parts. So I know that side AB is congruent to DB. So I'm going to put 1 tick mark on side AB and 1 tick mark on DB, and then I know that, let's see, I'm given an angle measurement here. So I have angle C is congruent to angle C, and in fact they're both 90 degrees. And so I want to find the angle of X. So since these are both 90 degrees and I know that they're congruent, I can just say 2x minus 16 is equal to 90 degrees, and I can solve my problem. So I'm going to end up with 106 is equal to 2x. So x is equal to 53. Now technically I don't need a degree mark on this as units because my x is actually in the problem. So I solve for x, and then go ahead and check your work. So when I check my work, I should get back to 90 degrees. 53 times 2 is 106 minus 16 is 90. There's my answer. Okay, and then in example 4, again, we're given that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF, and we want to find the measure of angle F. So I know from this problem, if I know the measure of angle C, then I'll have the measure of angle F. So there might be some clues that I can use to solve the problem. So first thing I want to do is mark up the triangle. So AB is congruent to DE. AC is congruent to DF. BC is congruent to FE. Okay, and I know angle A is congruent to angle D. They both are already marked as 90-degree angles. Angle B is congruent to angle E. And angle C is congruent to angle F. So in this problem, the side length here is a distractor. You don't need any of these side lengths to find the measure of angle F. All that I need to know is angle F is congruent to angle C. So if I can figure out what angle C is, then I know the measure of angle F. Well, measure of angle C, I know from the triangle sum theorem that since A is 90 degrees and B is 53 degrees, that all of my angles have to add up to 180. And since it's a right triangle, actually I know that triangle B and C both add up to 90 degrees, just to save me a step. But either way, if you set it up the long way, that works also. And if I solve, I'll get 37 degrees. Sorry, my paper's slipping. So angle C is equal to 37 degrees. So that must mean that angle F, since angle C is congruent to angle F is equal to 37 degrees. And notice, using correct notation, I have to put the little m there because I'm talking about the actual angle measurement of the angle. So it has to have the measure of angle F is equal to 37 degrees. Okay, so that's it. You can find more information on this in your textbook. Look on the assignment sheet and it tells you exactly what pages in your textbook you can look at. And if you log into the online textbook, there are more video lessons that you can watch. Probably more exciting than me.